Freedom House puts out an annual report on global internet freedom. The most recent data from Freedom House confirms what many of us in tech and media have been observing, that internet access not only continues to decline as it has for the last 10 years, but has dropped even more steeply in the last year in the middle of a pandemic. Turns out that the COVID-19 pandemic is a very convenient pretext for autocrats to take more control under the guise of protecting their populations. To state the blindingly obvious, access to the internet is critical to the ability of citizens to participate in society, and losing it means vastly reduced access to economic and social progress. But in this year, it takes an even more deadly turn, cutting off access to critical public health information, not only within your own country, but from around the world. We've long seen limits on internet access in places like China and Iran, but we are now seeing restrictions or threats, new restrictions or threats of restrictions in places like Myanmar, Hong Kong, Turkey, Vietnam, and Russia. So that's what we're going to unpack today. Luckily, we have an all-star panel who's going to help us make sense of this. And then we want to hear from you. So here's our plan. I'm going to introduce each of our panelists one at a time and ask them to speak. They all bring different sets of expertise to the topic. And in the meantime, we're going to be collecting your questions because in the second half of the hour, we will take their questions and we will direct them to the panelists. So at any time starting right now, if you want to ask a question later, which we'll get to later, just click, depending on what part of Zoom you're on, if you click on the Q&A button, I'm sorry, not that. If you click on the, what am I doing? Oh, if you click on the Q&A button, yeah. Sorry, Zoom keeps changing things, so it's a little confusing, but you can submit your question at the bottom of the screen. So again, you can put those in anytime and we will get to them in a little bit later. Okay, let's get going with our conversation. Our first speaker today is Adrian Shabazz. He is the Director for Technology and Democracy at Freedom House, as I previously mentioned, the organization, where he heads research and policy on human rights in the digital age. He is the lead author for Freedom on the Net, an annual report on global internet freedom, as well as the founder of Election Watch for the Digital Age, a data-driven initiative tracking the rise of censorship, disinformation, and violence ahead of national elections. I've asked him to speak first today because we want to get sort of a general overview in terms of what we're seeing in terms of internet freedom around the world. So over to you, Adrian.
Thank you so much, Vivian. Thank you, all of you who are attending. Thank you to my fellow panelists and to the Aspen Institute for organizing this great panel. So as Vivian mentioned, I'm going to start us off just with a global overview of what we're seeing through our reports. And unfortunately, COVID-19 has really accelerated society's reliance on digital technologies at a time when the internet is becoming less and less free. We have tracked a 10-year decline in internet freedom. This goes across all categories that we look at, from obstacles to accessing the internet, limits on content once people actually get online, as well as violations of user rights. And we have seen internet shutdowns being normalized as a policy tool for dealing with a lot of the externalities of the internet, whether that is the way it can contribute to disinformation, the way that it can be used by democratic activists to contest the results of a flawed election or to protest against dictatorship. Just to define this term, so internet shutdown is an intentional disruption of internet service by the state. And due to the significant influence and the role played by social media and messaging apps, many digital rights activists have actually extended that to also incorporate those apps and cases where governments will just have a blanket restriction on, let's say, Facebook or WhatsApp. They do take place at either a national or regional or city level. One interesting thing that we have seen is that they often are concentrated within territories that are home to marginalized ethnic and religious communities. And that brings me to the first reported incident of an internet shutdown, which took place in China's Xinjiang region, which is home to the Uyghur minority population. And the internet was actually cut for 10 months to the local population as sort of almost as a form of collective punishment against the population there. And unfortunately, that's a trend that we have seen extended to many countries that I'm sure will come up today, whether that's Cameroon, Ethiopia, or Myanmar. Why are these taking place? We generally see them around times of political unrest, such as elections or protests. There have been a few occasions where the internet was cut off in the aftermath or to prevent a terrorist attack, or at least the justification was. We also see these strange incidents of the internet being shut down or certain social media platforms being blocked wholesale to prevent high school students from cheating on their exams. And that brings me to sort of the impact that these have, which is that, obviously there's the human rights impact, which is cutting off people from their friends and family. Oftentimes people don't know how to protect themselves during a crisis. They can't share info with the outside world, cannot hold authorities accountable for human rights abuses that are often taking place at the same time. And then there's also significant collateral damage. So when this happens, oftentimes, it's not only about people losing access to Instagram or TikTok, it's also losing access to ATMs, to educational materials, certain phone services that run over the internet. Businesses lose the ability to communicate with their customers or their suppliers. And it even affects hospitals, banks, and the hospitality industry. So this is really a growing problem that touches on so many issues around internet freedom today. And it comes core to this question about the internet being, or this concept of the internet being a human right. And thankfully, the United Nations has come out to say internet shutdowns are a disproportionate restriction on human rights, regardless of the circumstances around what's happening in that particular country. And there's now been so much great efforts, including by Access Now and the Keep It Online Coalition, to track these incidents, which are unfortunately only happening more and more today.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for giving us that big picture, and a disturbing big picture it is. We're going to go next. We actually have a representative from Access Now, but we're going to save her for a little bit. And we're going to go next to Sophie Schmidt. Sophie is the founder and CEO of Rest of World, which is a global nonprofit news publication covering the impact of technology beyond the Western bubble. If you have not checked out Rest of World, I would encourage you to do so. And we should drop the link to them in the chat momentarily. She founded Rest of World in 2019 after a decade of living and working in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and witnessing firsthand how little coverage in the West, at least, that technology and entrepreneurship gets in many places outside of the usual suspects. So we're really happy to have you with us, Sophie. So Sophie, let's just drill down a little bit in terms of what Adrian was speaking about, in terms of the methods that governments are using to shut down the internet or access to certain parts of the internet, and what are the how are you seeing this play out in terms of your reporting at Rest of World?
Sure. Thank you for having me. So to answer your first question, as Adrian mentioned, the decline of the last 10 years has only made the practice more widespread, and governments have more tools than ever at their disposal. It's no longer a single on-off switch. In fact, you have ways of geo-targeting, you have very specific application and content blocking. You have something called throttling, which is incredibly popular, I think, maybe because it seems to get them out of the shutdown bucket, but in fact has more of the same effect. I have essentially three observations that I think I could make, both as a tech person and now someone working in media, that might help frame our discussion. So the normalization that Adrian mentioned is spot on. A lot of attention, I think, is given in reporting now to protesters and civilians who fight back with new tools and new creative strategies. The Milk Tea Alliance, of course, is the best known one of this. Those are incredibly exciting and encouraging, but our reporting shows again and again that the imbalance of power here is really important. Unfortunately, there are the hard truths of internet infrastructure. We like to think that the internet exists above us in some sort of magical realm, but there are physical entry and exit points. There are physical telecom towers run by companies that operate under the blessing of governments. There are landing points for submarine cables. This matters because the places where internet shutdowns are increasingly happening are places that are still coming online, and tech literacy is a challenge. You can be an incredibly digitally savvy young person, but you may not have gotten a chance yet to really know what encryption means. Journalism plays a role here, I think, because there's a certain kind of breathless coverage that platforms like Telegram or Signal tend to get, when in reality, all platforms are hackable. So it's important, I think, for civilians everywhere, especially as this type of behavior creeps into more democratic states, for people to really understand what they're up against. The second observation is that the search for a sufficient deterrent for states seems as far off as ever. The more widespread, the more normalized it becomes. Just speaking from the media side, 5 to 6 years ago, you had almost no coverage of internet shutdowns. Now you have some, which is great, but it tends to be pretty paint by numbers. Government shuts down this for this reason. And I think journalists struggle to find new angles to these stories. We have to, though, because you'll start to desensitize more of the global community the more common it becomes. The third observation that I think doesn't get enough attention is essentially a third actor in this dynamic, which is the rise of private cybersecurity companies that are operating in a booming market for their services and for their toolkits. Just this morning, we published a story about the pipeline from the famous 8200 technical unit of the IDF into Israel's enormously successful cybersecurity industry, which I think has something like $1 billion in annualized sales. They can sell essentially commodified hacking services all around the world, sometimes openly, sometimes through third-party brokers to maintain some deniability. And they further complicate the effort to fight for free access to information.
Thank you, Sophie. And of course, there's also the flip side on the cybersecurity issue, which is maybe a subject for another panel, but the fact that cybersecurity hacks themselves, denial of service attacks, can also infringe on people's access to the internet. So it's very complicated.
Very much.
Thank you. We're now going to turn to Shayna Bauchner. And Shayna is a researcher in the Asian division of Human Rights Watch. Her work focuses on issues including refugees and migrants, women's rights, and threats to human rights defenders. She has a specialty around Myanmar, which of course is one of the more recent sovereign nations to really significantly curtail access to the internet in their country. So Shayna, tell us a little bit, just drilling down into Myanmar as a case study. Tell us what's happening there.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for having me join this panel. So, one thing to note with regard to Myanmar is that cutting access to the internet as sort of a measure of repression and control isn't something that just began since the coup last month. This is a tool that the previous government had been using over the past few years to block internet in ethnic minority regions where there was ongoing conflict. So this sort of ironically was a tactic that was established by the administration led by Aung San Suu Kyi and is now being employed by the military junta. One of the first things that the junta did on February 1st, after it arrested Aung San Suu Kyi and the president and other civilian leaders, and basically began this coup, was to shut the internet down across the country. This obviously, immediately stalled the spread of information about what was happening in Myanmar to the outside world. What we've seen over the past 5 weeks, in addition to brutal crackdowns on protesters and mass arrest, is the use of internet restrictions as really a hallmark of the junta's regime. They started right off the bat by banning various websites. They blocked Facebook, and then immediately after called on telecoms companies to block Instagram and Twitter as well. People have, for the most part, been able to get around this through the use of VPNs. About 2 weeks in, so for the past 3 weeks, they began these coordinated nightly internet shutdowns. So every night at 1 a.m., the internet is completely shut down, essentially across the country, and remains shut down until the morning. There have been sort of a lot of rumors around the rationale for these nightly blackouts. What we know is that authorities use these hours at night to conduct raids. So they've been showing up at the houses of different targets, of activists, of journalists, of government officials to threaten them, to arrest them. This weekend, there was an official from Suu Kyi's party, the NLD, who was picked up at night and tortured and killed by security forces. Over 1,600 people have been arrested in total over the past 5 weeks of this coup. So these shutdowns are really providing some cover for abuses. And this is, like Adrian mentioned, very much a form of collective punishment on the people of Myanmar, and particularly the pro-democracy movement. I mean, I will mention the military, I think, in attempting to sort of revert to the period before Myanmar's democratization process began, so 2011 and before, when it was this very isolated nation, they are running into the fact that Myanmar is a very different country now than it was then. And the internet, which wasn't really a factor then, is now playing a vital role in the coordination and information sharing of the pro-democracy movement. So their efforts to sort of stifle that sort of activism as of yet has not been successful.
It's a really chilling case study. Thank you, Shayna. I'm going to turn to Felicia in a minute, but just as a reminder, everybody, because a little bit later we're going to be getting to your questions. I see some folks have been submitting questions. Again, you click on the Q&A button, enter your question, and please, if you feel comfortable doing so, please share your name, your affiliation, and where you are in the world. Just if you feel comfortable, just to give some nice context to the question. And those of you that have submitted questions, you can just jump back in and add that, and we'll pick that up. Thank you. So I now want to turn to Felicia Anthonio. She is works with Access Now as a campaigner for the Keep It On campaign, a global campaign that fights against internet shutdowns. The Keep It On coalition is made up of over 210 organizations across the world, and fortuitously, Access Now just put a report out last week, which Felicia, I know you're going to speak about, with a list of the current shutdowns. So we'd be very interested in hearing about your latest findings, and also want to hear from you about advocacy efforts around preventing these shutdowns and where we need to go.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be part of this panel. So everything that Adrian and my other co-panelists have said falls in line with the findings of our report that was launched last week. That is, the report is titled "Shattered Dreams and Lost Opportunities, the Fight to Keep It On." And this captures or summarizes exactly how internet shutdowns do impact lives across the globe, and how stakeholders like the Keep It On Coalition continue to push back. And so in 2020, Access Now and the Keep It On Coalition, under the Stop Shutdown Track Optimization Project, documented 155 internet shutdowns, at least in 29 countries. And the key findings ties very well with what has previously been mentioned. Over hundreds of millions of people were cut off the internet during a global pandemic, thus losing access to life-saving health information, education, and work opportunities. And then also shutdowns, we did note, were used to target marginalized communities. In 2020, nearly 1 million residents of the Rohingya refugee camps in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh were affected by the internet shutdown that was imposed by the government. And then over people suffered internet restrictions, which lasted over 355 days. That's impeding people's access to critical information. And then India did top the list with 109 incidents of shutdowns. And then still in India, every 2 weeks, people in Jammu and Kashmir regions endured yet an extension or new mobile network shutdown ordered by the administration throughout the year. And then increasingly, we did document incidents of shutdowns being used in response to ongoing violence. For example, in Yemen, in Azerbaijan, and then in Ethiopia's Tigray region, we did see that internet shutdowns were being imposed during conflicts. And then the goal of these shutdowns, as already previously been indicated, governments impose these shutdowns to silence protests, to sway elections, hide human rights violations and abuses, and others use it as a bargain with bad actors, with the support of some companies, tech companies, being able, providing the resources for governments to be able to implement these censorship. And then finally, as the Keep It On Coalition, one thing that stands out for us is the fact that there is an important need for us to continue to push back against these shutdowns, given their devastating impact. But then increasingly, as we become strategic in pushing back, governments are also being innovative in investing millions of resources in order to proactively prepare to impose these shutdowns. And they are learning from other governments that have imposed these shutdowns. And so there is a need for us to continue to push back to ensure that these shutdowns are ended in the near future.
Thank you, Felicia. You have capped, all of you have painted really an incredibly disturbing picture of not only where things are, how bad they've gotten, but where they're going. I want to just pick up on something that you said, Felicia, just now, that also was similar to what Sophie said earlier, which is that the more there are, the more widespread these shutdowns become, the more normalized it becomes. You know, Felicia, it's chilling what you just said, as that many more countries are preparing the technology to be able to do more widespread shutdowns, or even introduce them for the first time. So, you know, the big question really to all the panelists right now is, how do we reverse that? What is it? What are the mechanisms that will reverse this terrible normalization and undo, not only protect people's civil liberties, their health, but sort of undo what has been, you know, decades of progress made through access to the internet? Felicia, I know you just spoke, but I'll just follow up with you first. Where do you see, what do you think are the best levers that can be accessed either by individual countries or by NGOs or others?
Yes, I would refer to an example how Sandvine was involved in the internet shutdown that happened in Belarus. And I think the most important thing is for us to be able to investigate and uncover these mechanisms being adopted by governments to disrupt the internet. And so the research that was, the investigation that was carried out, which brought to light that Sandvine was actually behind the infrastructure that was used by the Belarusian government to shut down the internet last year, was really important, making us turn our advocacy towards these companies to ensure that they recognize their responsibility to respect human rights and to rather foster them and not encourage governments by providing them with the relevant resources to do that. And when we first called out Sandvine regarding its involvement in the Belarusian shutdown, at first they did resist and didn't want to cooperate when we called on them to stop whatever engagement they had with the government of Belarus. But then later on, they did accept that, okay, internet has become part of or enables human rights. And so they did cancel whatever contracts they had with the Belarusian government. And I think such examples are really important. Such discoveries are important for us to call out companies that are helping governments to perpetuate these acts of repression against their own citizens, and to continue to research to see how these governments are getting more innovative, and also have kind of be a step ahead of them, that is from the civil society perspective, and to ensure that these shutdowns are ended, and we all provide or work towards providing everyone with internet access for their respective use or need.
So that's very interesting. You're saying that one of the best levers is to put pressure on the individual providers of services in those countries to not comply with autocratic demands to cut off that access. I'd love to hear other levers or other ways to reverse this. I know, Adrian, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Vivian. And just to add to what Felicia had to say here, which I think is really important, that we've also seen some success with strategic litigation. So in a number of countries that we covered, and I believe Rest of the World had a fantastic article about Sudan that maybe Sophie can bring up, but we have seen some strong wins driven by, in many cases, civil society. So there was this court case in Sudan ordering an end to the country's shutdown. Also, there were judges in Indonesia who found that a government-imposed shutdown in certain regions there had been illegal. And even in India, which is the world leader in internet shutdowns, unfortunately, the Supreme Court had ruled that the shutdowns in Kashmir were in fact illegal. So there is thankfully, there is some pushback happening, and I think that there is some room for even us, to be more supportive of these efforts to really bring these cases to court, where in some of these countries we actually have seen some wins.
Interesting. So there's putting pressure on the technology companies, court cases. I don't know if you want to say something about that Sudan case, Sophie, or bring up
I'd love to. It's one of the greatest stories I think we've done. Thank you, Adrian. So this was a story that covered the Sudanese shutdown, which lasted quite a long time. I think it was June 2012. And the extraordinary thing was that the person who had probably the biggest role in turning the internet back on was actually a lawyer. He, among other things, he read the terms of service of his cell phone contract, and he determined that the shutdown violated his terms of service. And so he took the government to court for that reason, and the court ruled in his favor. So it's extraordinary that anybody actually read the terms of service, first of all. But he found a loophole, and it was a loophole that the court recognized. And so for that reason, I think that's a great source of hope. The other thing I'll just mention from that story that is somewhat less legitimate in that way is the idea that not only in, excuse me, go away, sorry. Sorry.
No worries.
So within the telecom capital, within the telecom that was, that was responsible for the shutdown. When the order came through, there were essentially moles in the telecom company who defied the order by setting up their own skunkworks intranet that provided a lot of the internet service that help the protesters eventually push the government back. So there is a weak link in shutdown orders, which of course are the humans. And not every shutdown is a complete blackout for that reason. And humans will always be the weak point in that way. So there's a small source of hope there. Nothing you can bank on, but it is interesting that you see it again and again.
Yeah, interesting. Again, we've talked about court cases. We've talked about putting pressure on the technology companies. I haven't yet heard anybody mention political pressure. And in fact, we have a question. I'm going to start to weave the questions in here from Maggie Gray, who is with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who asks, what can the US government do to combat internet shutdowns by authoritarian states? Is there anything that the US government can do? Anybody have a response to that one, Adrian?
Sure, I'll jump in. So thankfully, there is a lot that the United States government can do. There is some that I think the US government is doing, but I think that the main thing is putting this on the agenda of, on foreign policy, and then bolstering the United States capacity on cyber diplomacy. So right now, I think, well, recently our diplomats who are devoted to these issues was trimmed down, which I think is unfortunate. So I think that there are now some bills up in Congress that would actually bolster the U.S. diplomatic presence on digital issues, on internet freedom, on encryption, internet shutdowns, you name it. So there is a lot that can be done. I think that we have to have an investment. I think that the U.S. needs to be a leader on these issues. Unfortunately, I think after it's going very much ahead in the race, especially when it comes on the corporate side, there hasn't been as much leadership as I think we would like. There are some ways, though, that I think pointing out the economic impact that this has, particularly in countries that are developing, where there have been some studies that show that this is really in the millions of dollars per day, the impact that it has on the economy. And so there might be ways that this could be tied as a condition into certain forms of economic aid or development, whereby if a country does shut down the internet, they are then in violation, or that countries that have a record of shutting down the internet are no longer eligible to receive certain types of financial or economic aid.
Do we think there's the political will to see that through?
Well, we have seen some victories on other things. I think that when there is the will, right now, unfortunately, the conversation when it comes to digital policy is so, let's say, occupied with things like disinformation or foreign intervention. And so I do think that there needs to be a rebalancing around looking at these issues of human rights, of things like data localization, internet shutdowns, and a lot of the different laws that we see being passed around the world that then give the local government greater control over companies that are operating in that space, because those are then oftentimes used to commit human rights abuses.
Thank you. All right, we've got some really good questions coming in. Just as a reminder, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, enter your question with your name and your affiliation and where you are in the world, if you feel comfortable adding that. So we have a question from Trish Remo, no affiliation, asking what is the role of VPNs in the battle for internet freedom? Shayna, I think you mentioned that VPNs were a way in Myanmar, that some are skirting the internet blackouts, but maybe you can say a little bit more about the role of VPNs, whether it's in Myanmar or elsewhere, and then any of the other panelists are happy to feel free to jump in.
Sure. I mean, yes, certainly VPNs, which were not necessarily that widely used in Myanmar in the past, have become over the past sort of 5 weeks very well known among internet users in Myanmar, and have been the way that that these activists and protesters have gotten around some of the blocks on Facebook, on other social media sites. What's worrying is sort of the junta's ability through its various kind of levers of control to even hinder some of the access to VPNs, particularly the free VPNs that the majority of people in Myanmar have been trying to use. The military has been able to find ways to sort of chip away at their ability to get around the existing internet blockages. So it's, in the end, very much a stopgap, and something that is concerning to see the ways in which that is being rolled back. The kind of long-term concern in Myanmar is that the government, the military government, is attempting to sort of set up a broader internet firewall in a way that reflects the restrictions that we see in a place like China.
You know, I realized for some in the audience, I may be using too much jargon when I say VPN. Can you just briefly, not from a technology point of view, but can you just briefly explain for those who don't try to watch in the Western world, who don't use VPNs to watch television shows from other countries, what a VPN is and how it can be useful here?
Sure. Yeah, a VPN, a virtual private network, and not without a technology background. Basically, someone can download and will be able to access the internet by using an IP that is not blocked. So using IP from another country to be able to access the internet if it's been geographically blocked in their country.
Great, thank you so much. So the next question, there's a lot of questions around different solutions and workarounds, which I find interesting. So this next one in that spirit is from Cyril Wiggett. I'm sorry, Cyril, if I'm pronouncing your surname incorrectly, is a fellow with the Royal Society of Arts. His question is, do you think that the future internet technology through satellites could fix such issues that everyone has a way to access the internet unfiltered? So I don't know if anybody has the background on that to know whether that is a feasible. We don't really necessarily have hardcore technologists on this panel, but is there anyone that knows, has looked at whether that's a feasible solution?
I can give it a shot here.
Great.
So people have looked into this, and there are some companies and also nonprofits that are playing around with this technology in order to, as Cyril has mentioned, to find a way to restore access to the internet during an internet shutdown. Satellites are one part of it. There's also something called mesh networks where people can sort of connect with each other's phones. So you're almost creating like a local area network that is not connected to the outside internet, but that is connected to everyone who might be in a particular square. But really on satellites, I think one of the obstacles has been the cost. These are very expensive to set up oftentimes. They do need to be pre-installed in many occasions. And so it's sort of in countries where you anticipate an internet shutdown happening, it's hard to sort of just turn it on with a flick of the switch. One country where it has been talked about a lot is in Iran, where the internet is heavily censored and monitored. And that just brought me up to this question of VPNs and sort of a broader trend that I just wanted to bring up, which is how Iran is, as Shayna mentioned, moving towards this firewall approach to cutting itself off from the rest of the internet. People think of China as the core example of this. Iran has been very busy over the past decade or so investing in local infrastructure. And during the latest internet shutdown, or maybe not the latest because they have continued these, but during one of the major internet shutdowns that took place during mass protests in 2019, I believe it was, what happened is the authorities kept local connections, but cut off access to the outside world. And so people had access to sort of a pre-vetted internet that consisted of websites and services that were tightly controlled and monitored by the authorities. They just didn't have access to anything from the outside world. And as part of that, people were desperately trying to get on VPNs. And through the government's control of internet infrastructure, not going into the technical details, but had essentially blocked access to all external connections. And so it was very difficult also to get on VPNs during those internet shutdowns.
Thank you, Adrian. We have a question from Marjan. I'm sorry for the mangling folks' names. Marjan Asasi, who's a doctoral student at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, who asks, I'm curious to hear the panelists' thoughts on the US use of the internet to monitor citizens and the increasingly close collaboration between the government and private sector in matters of surveillance. So obviously this is a different set of issues. It's not, in the US, there is no blockage to access to the internet, but both in the internet and in other countries, there is increasingly close collaboration in some instances between the government and tech companies to monitor. So, oops, it looks like we have lost Felicia, hopefully who will be back. But is there anybody that would like to take that on if that's something that you're looking at, if not in the US, then in other parts of the world? Sophie, is this something that you've reported on? And I know you don't cover the United States, but you would cover other parts of the world.
You know, we haven't specifically, but if I could add one thing, just Adrian's last point, mesh networking that has been around for a long time. Many people remember hearing about sneaker nets in Afghanistan, places with a lot of connectivity gaps. We covered a really fascinating app called Bridgeify, which is actually from Mexico, which was downloaded, I think, about 2 million times over the span of a couple of days during the Hong Kong protests, and is now very active in Myanmar. And so having actually taking a step back from the most advanced, which might be satellites, into something that's actually a little bit more primitive in the technical sense, may be another way out of some of these very tight situations.
Thank you. We will, I think we just don't have, we don't have, folks on this panel to address that specific issue. But we've got another series of issues that are questions that are related, having to do with the notion of internet access as a human right. And so we had an anonymous questioner asking for the panel's thoughts on internet access as a human right. And also related to that, a question from Sukumar Ganapati asking if the government should recognize internet access as a basic infrastructure so that those internet rights can be protected. So of course, these are related questions. Felicia, welcome back. I wonder if you, if Access Now has a point of view about internet access as a human right, and whether that is will help increase international pressure to maintain internet access.
We do see internet access as an enabler of other human rights. And so definitely there's a need to prioritize that to ensure that people have access to the internet in order to and exercise the other rights that are linked to internet access. And indeed, it's a basic need that everyone should have the right to.
Shayna, is that something that you're that you see at Human Rights Watch, looking at positioning internet access as a human right, and whether that increases or will help bolster international pressure to maintain access?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, access to internet definitely falls under sort of broader category of the right to free speech, and it's sort of become a critical part, particularly as we've seen the past year. As Felicia said, the way it's tied to all of these other rights, including accessing the right to health, particularly under COVID and the threat that internet restrictions have. I mean, what we've seen in places where the government is using this in situations of conflict, or where it says that it's shutting down the internet in response to some sort of emergency, is then the immediate threat to people's safety and security. So, the need to sort of, yes, keep this issue on the fore in international forum, both in, at the UN in Geneva and New York, is certainly critical. And I think we've seen that kind of slowly increasing and expanding over the past number of years, but more to sort of, highlight the kind of intersectionality of these rights concerns is needed.
Great. And Adrian, at Freedom House, I know this is an issue for you as well. Yes.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is the core of our report, is looking at this question of internet freedom, which is really just the idea that the same rights held by people offline must be protected online. So it is promising to see that the internet, there is now largely a consensus, both among civil society and business, but most particularly among governments, that digital rights are human rights, so to speak. It's just unfortunate that that so many governments are translating many of their tools for repression from the offline world onto the online world. And in many cases, there are ways that digital activism makes people more vulnerable to repression, due to the fact that, let's say that social media has really increased civic space exponentially. It's just that in many cases that civic space is highly monitored by the government, and it does make it easier when the government has that technology in order to identify people that are speaking out against the regime or using certain types of language that are off limits in that country, and then to be able to arrest them and punish them.
Speaking of speech, we have a number of questions around the intersection between internet shutdowns and mis and disinformation. So this question is, and then there were similar questions from others. This question is from Sarah Al-Shalash, she asks, how important are blunt blanket strategies like internet shutdowns for anti-democratic regimes, as opposed to things like misinformation, trolls farms, and other forms of dissent suppression that seek to drown out dissenters? Certainly, I will say I don't know that those two strategies are necessarily mutually exclusive, but it would be interesting. And I will also add my own sort of question to that, which is we have seen in many cases where speech or access has been suppressed, that it has been in the name of controlling fake news. For those of you that may be listening and not looking, I'm using air quotes, as a way to protect the population, but really as a way to suppress free expression. So I'd love to hear from any of the panelists about what you see as the intersectionality around controlling speech, the use of mis and disinformation, and internet shutdowns. Go ahead, Felicia.
I can speak.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Sophie.
Please. No, Felicia, please go ahead.
Okay, so what we've noticed over the years is that most governments tend to justify shutdowns by giving diverse reasons, and preventing mis or disinformation is one of them. But then in actual fact, what these, when you look at what happens on the ground and the justifications that governments give, there is, they do not correlate, because shutdowns would normally happen around elections. And so if governments say we are imposing shutdowns to prevent the spread of disinformation or fake news or hate speech, indeed, it means we are imposing shutdowns to silence dissent, and or to call protests, or to prevent people from accessing information. So the actual reasons or the actual justifications of these shutdowns tend not to match with the justifications that the government gives, especially also when the government cites national security or precautionary measures, which is a very broad bucket, indicating how, and sometimes you wonder how an internet shutdown is going to restore national security. And over the years, we've noted that whenever there's a shutdown, things become more chaotic. People are being abused. People are cut off the rest of the world. Those outside that particular country are not able to monitor what is happening. And so I think there's always what's the word? We don't always get to see these justifications that governments give reflect on the realities that is happening on the ground. So I would say that internet shutdowns are disproportionate, they violate human rights, they are unnecessary, and they put people in, they kind of endanger lives rather than protect people from disinformation or hate speech. And so government should look at other forms of regulation rather than completely shutting down the internet when people need it most to carry out their own activities during a particular national crisis or national event.
Thank you, Felicia. Sophie, intersection of internet shutdown and mis and disinformation.
Just adding to that, from our own reporting in Myanmar, it's very clear that disinformation and misinformation perpetrated by the government played a huge role in how the protest started, right? Because you could not design a better environment for disinformation to reign than in a blackout. People are in an incredibly vulnerable position. They need information. And the governments that tend to do this, it's not their first time, right? They've been shaping public opinion for years in their own social networks. And so they're already prepared. One example of this is that in Myanmar's case, right, when you start to have rolling blackouts, curfew blackouts, throttling, sometimes that's a tactic to push activists or protesters off of the platforms that the government has a little bit less control over and into more insecure networks like SMS and like Voice. But even in the places where I think people hope that they can feel safe, like Telegram or Signal, there's always a lot of infiltration by government actors on those platforms. And so really nowhere is safe in those spaces. And disinformation, unfortunately, again, in countries with limited media environments, limited journalism accountability, and limited tech literacy, it's incredibly hard to tell fact from fiction.
So that shutdowns and the throttling are just one tactic among many to control speech. We have a question from, this one is for you, Adrian. I'm directing it to you because it references your opening remarks. It's from Rong Shi, who is with Voice of America's Mandarin service. In reference to what you spoke about, a pushback in Xinjiang, Rong Shi asked, it says, it seems all the means mentioned are impossible in China. How do solutions work in that context? So can you expand upon that a little bit, specifically with reference to China?
Sure. So the incident that I had brought up happened in 2009, and that was one of the first incidents of an internet shutdown that took place. Obviously, a lot has changed in China since then, and I think that if there is a trend, perhaps this is it. The government there no longer relies on internet shutdowns as much as it has, in the past, and as much as other countries have. And instead, they have built up this apparatus for monitoring and censoring, and then also spouting out propaganda and disinformation online in order to avoid having to use internet shutdowns, if that makes sense. So I think on the continuum, we can see that internet shutdowns being used as a blunt tactic, where oftentimes governments don't want to resort to them because of the economic or even political costs of cutting off the internet for the entire population. And on the other hand, you have governments that are highly sophisticated and have invested a lot in either the technical infrastructure required to monitor what is happening online, all of these comments, to introduce things like keyword censorship, where if you are texting with somebody using a Chinese messaging app, there are certain keywords that are banned. And so it's just automatically that messages will be censored when you're communicating with one another. That being said, there is still some ability to jump the Great Firewall, if you will, and you do have a contingent of people within China. It's not only foreign expats, if you will. There's also people who are using circumvention tools in order to gain access to, let's say, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, but not only that, also to other news sites in order to get a more reliable and diverse, in order to get access to a more reliable and diverse news environment. So while it is one of the most restricted, it is actually the most restricted internet environment as rated by Freedom on the Net. They've been the worst of the worst for, I think, 4 or 5 years in a row. There is still this hope, and a lot of it comes from the work being done by technical experts, the makers of circumvention tools, VPN providers, and they are trapped in this cat and mouse game oftentimes with the government. And I think that's also, I should mention, one thing where the US government can help is in investing more in creating these tools for circumvention and making sure that they are out there where people in these restricted environments can easily access them, and that they know about them so that they can read up about what their government is doing in places where, as Sophie said, the media environment is so heavily restricted.
Yeah. As we're drawing just into the final moments of this session, I appreciated you during a pretty grim conversation we've been having, finding a glimmer of hope. And I wonder if I just ask the other panelists as well, if there's anything, just as we move towards the end, if you would like to share where you see glimmer of hope, or what we might look for towards this just deeply worrying trend of of access to the internet and all of the good that that brings being shut down. So I will open it up to Adrian. You were so articulate about it, but now Shayna, Sophie, or Felicia. Sophie, go ahead.
Sure. So this is maybe with my media hat on. I put my faith in people, right, in humans, and these are not the solutions that are going to solve the macro problem. But time and time again, we find individuals who have been incredibly resourceful, incredibly creative, and from the state's perspective, unpredictable. In the Iranian shutdown that Adrian mentioned, we found that people were retooling their satellite dishes to transfer information packets between each other across a massive shutdown. In West Papua, during another blackout period, activists literally hiked through the jungle mountains through Papua New Guinea to find a luxury hotel to use the Wi-Fi there. So don't discount people here, because they are always going to find, and the loopholes are always going to find a way out. It's not the macro solution, but it is always a source for hope for me.
Yeah, never underestimate the resourcefulness of humans. Shayna, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo just what Sophie said, and watching over the past 5 weeks in Myanmar, the millions of people who have been participating in the civil disobedience movement. The military had announced that it was going to institute this law, a new cybersecurity law that was going to even further restrict internet access, and was going to pressure telecoms companies, threaten them with imprisonment if they didn't comply with various government directives. And civil society immediately started this campaign. I mean, tens of thousands of people were tweeting and posting on Facebook, criticizing this law, which then got escalated to governments who released statements. We saw various EU member states also condemning the law. And the military, which, I mean, the junta has so far proven fairly unbothered, it has not moved ahead with pushing it through. So I think, yes, there are some of these glimmers of hope for us to hold on to.
Thank you, Shayna. And Felicia, I will give you the last word.
Yes, I agree with everything that has been said. And yes, the people are very powerful. And I always say that you can shut down the internet, but then you cannot shut down the passion and the voices of the people. So, but in whichever way they would find means to come back online. They would find ways to highlight whatever it is that is happening there. And we've seen what's happening in Myanmar. We saw what happened in Sudan. We saw what happened in Belarus. And so the interest and the passion to keep the fight on is there. And civil society continues to provide support for individuals around the world, like the Keep It On Coalition. And we think there's an interest in stopping shutdowns by other governments around the world. And so let's keep the fire on and keep pushing back against internet shutdowns globally.
Thank you, Felicia, Anthonio, Shayna Bauchner, Adrian Shabazz, Sophie Schmidt. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for your thoughtful questions. And this will be posted online later on Aspen Institute's Twitter account @Aspen Digital. And we will see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.